In his book, A Peculiar Institution, renowned author David Garland begins his discussion of capital punishment by describing the execution of two very notorious, depraved serial killers. However, he later explains that throughout America, the death penalty is often utilized in mundane robbery murders, which are of course much more common than serial killings. Still, under the best of circumstances, when the death penalty is used to rid society of vicious, depraved serial murderers, Garland contends that even then, capital punishment in the United States is a deeply debated and perhaps troubled institution. Throughout the book, Garland aims to describe and explain this peculiar institution as well as explore its relationship to the society that sustains it. This is a practice that is by and large unique to America, as it is the only country in the Western world to practice this. According to Garland, despite all the discussion regarding the use of the death penalty in America, this is a sentence that is rarely carried out. For example, last year, there were approximately 60 executions that were completed in the United States. The U.S. averages about 14,000 homicides a year, but completed death sentences are something that rarely occur in America. Also, even though the U.S. is a rare exception, since it is the only Western nation to utilize capital punishment, Garland reminds us that several American states abolished the death penalty long before it was fashionable to do so throughout the world. In fact, Michigan has been an abolitionist state since 1846. Today there are 35 states which have the death penalty. However, the majority of convicted killers, the vast majority, end up serving a lifelong prison sentence rather than being put to death. Even if a jury imposes death, which only occurs in less than 1% of all homicides, the majority of these death penalty sentences never come to fruition. So since the overwhelming majority of convicted murderers in the United States die of natural causes, one may wonder why there is so much discussion regarding execution in America to begin with. David Garland discusses Furman versus Georgia, the 1972 case which temporarily abolished capital punishment in the United States. According to Garland, in the Furman case, the court ruled that the death penalty was being applied in a manner that was racially biased. However, Garland contends that even after capital punishment was reinstated, racial discrimination still continues to exist within this peculiar institution. He argues that today the race of the victim often determines whether or not a guilty capital murder defendant will be given the death penalty. In his book, Garland is troubled by the fact that there is a connection between 19th century lynchings and 21st century capital punishment. He also seems to find it rather curious that southern states are by and large the only ones that practice executions. In fact, Garland contends that in many states outside of the South, executions only occur when a death row inmate abandons his appeals and essentially volunteers to be put to death. Garland contends that he is not out to critique capital punishment as it is currently practiced in America. Rather, the author states that his goal is to provide a sociological history of the death penalty. And while most industrialized democracies have abandoned this practice, he argues that both India and Japan are two democratic countries which also have retained the institution of capital punishment. Garland also contends that it is not useful to classify the U.S. as a country that retains the death penalty and compare it to countries in Europe that have long abolished capital punishment. He argues that this comparison fails to take into account the fact that states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Rhode Island have been abolitionist since the mid-19th century. In fact, Garland contends that even though the 35 states and the federal government have capital punishment as an option, it is rarely imposed and is subject to close regulation. In fact, the U.S. has moved to the minimalist end of the continuum and may very well follow the lead of countries such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand by abandoning the practice altogether within the very near future. Still, it is evident that Americans love to punish. Besides the fact the majority of states retain the death penalty, the United States also leads the world in its incarceration rate. In his book, Garland provides a discussion of David Foucault's account of the death penalty. He argues that Foucault's account is not an appropriate framework to analyze the institution of capital punishment in the United States today. In the 21st century, policymakers claim that capital punishment reflects the will of the people. And as Garland points out, only a jury can impose the death penalty on a defendant who is convicted of a capital crime. Also, today, executions are designed to minimize bodily injury and degradation, which is much different than the images of Damiens, which are depicted by Foucault. Still, Garland argues that in the U.S., most of the decision-making about punishment is made at the local level. In fact, local political actors who are often elected are responsible for making important decisions that involve life and death. For example, a local district attorney has discretion as to whether or not to seek the death penalty. And if a defendant is convicted and sentenced to death, a state governor has the authority to commute an individual's sentence or grant clemency. Garland poses very, very interesting questions that are worth our consideration. For instance, why do states go to so much trouble and expense to enact death penalty laws when they are so rarely enforced or utilized? Also, if a death sentence is imposed at trial, why is it so likely that the defendant will never actually be executed? Rather, it is much, much more likely that an individual who is sentenced to death will have this penalty overturned or die in prison of natural causes, even if this sentence is not overturned. So given this, many people wonder why the U.S. retains the death penalty given the fact that it is so seldom utilized. There is also a tremendous amount of variation in how the death penalty is applied from state to state. On page 43, Garland points out that 1/3 of the states which utilize capital punishment only have death penalty trials very, very rarely, and they have extremely small populations of death row inmates with few or no executions. The second third of these states use the death penalty at trial and have large death penalty populations, but they very seldom execute inmates. And finally, the last third of the states which have the death penalty seek capital punishment at trial, have large populations of death row inmates, and make more limited use of execution. This variance is quite unique. It is also worth pointing out that capital punishment is, by and large, a Southern phenomenon. According to Garland, since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated, 83% of all American executions have occurred in the South. Texas alone accounts for more than 1/3 of the 1,193 executions that have taken place. And as mentioned earlier, on the rare occasion when a northern inmate is executed, it is fairly likely that he is a volunteer who has waived all of his appeals. Garland points out that the legal process involved in capital punishment is very lengthy and elaborate. The U.S. Supreme Court even has a death clerk whose job it is to handle last-minute filings and coordinate with any local execution team to carry out the sentence. The length of time between the actual sentence and execution can be substantial. It can last decades, which probably does not satisfy victims' needs for closure or retribution. At the beginning of 2010, there were more than 3,000 prisoners on death rows, and again, an average of about 60 inmates are put to death each year in the U.S. Also, the cost of capital punishment is substantial. which seems like a waste of taxpayer resources, especially considering the fact that up to 66% of defendants who are given the death penalty will have their sentences reversed. Refer to page 47 for some figures regarding the cost. Garland also discusses how local politics influences the death penalty in the U.S. In European nations, judges and prosecutors are typically tenured civil servants who are not directly accountable to voters. However, this is not the case in the U.S. As a result, local politics often come into play as justice officials seek to win elections or stay in office. Also, all regions in the United States which utilize capital punishment employ lethal injection. This actual execution is very clinical, almost anticlimactic, and appears to be a medicalized, bureaucratized procedure. Of course, as Garland points out, the American Medical Association refuses to allow its members to take part in any executions. There is much to digest and reflect upon in the first 69 pages of David Garland's book. Obviously, I cannot outline everything in this short lecture. As you read throughout the book, try to find points of interest, especially those which have not been covered as of yet, and bring any questions or comments you may have to the discussion. We are about to begin a very fascinating, albeit brief, journey as we unravel what may very well be one of America's most peculiar institutions.